Hello, happy 4th of July. Welcome to Keep Left, the podcast that looks at politics from a lefty perspective. I'm John O'Connor, here to talk about all things politics during this multiple election year. And first off, I want to say I'm sorry for getting the Project 2025 title wrong. Apparently, I was thinking too much about the song In the Year 2525 by the cosmic pop duo Zager and Evans. I had that song in my head a little too much, so I kept on saying Project 2525. So it is in fact Project 2025, and I will put a post-it on my computer to make sure I don't get that wrong going forward. So again, apologies for that. Today, in honor of Independence Day here in America, we're going to take a break from American politics and look at what's going on in the UK, because today is, in fact, Election Day in Britain. And I think it's a good time to look at what will probably, depending on what the results are today, go down in history as the worst campaign ever run. And frankly, that is regardless of what the result is. Even if it's better than expected for the Conservative Party in Britain and the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, even if somehow the majority that Labour is about to have is much closer than expected, even if somehow, some way, the Conservative Party ekes out an unfathomable majority, inexplicable majority, which I don't think anyone expects, the polls were somehow laughably wrong, then this was nevertheless the worst political campaign in modern history. And the reason why I think I'm safe to say that is that it's not just that anything that could go wrong went wrong, it's that decisions that were made at every point along the way seemed designed to lose the election. Now, I think we here in the States are looking at some decisions made by the Biden campaign or made sometimes by the Trump campaign are just irrational or just plain stupid. Many people point to the Hillary Clinton campaign as a dumb campaign, for example. But these decisions literally are worse than just about anything you can imagine. I think you'd have to go back to the Rudy Giuliani campaign back in 2016 or 2012 to come up with 2020 to come up with an example of a campaign that is worse than that, where he raised millions and millions of dollars and walked away with just a single delegate, to come up with a campaign that is worse. And yet Rishi Sunak, who's the current prime minister, had a much greater institutional advantage than Rudy Giuliani ever did back in 2016, and is nevertheless just made poor decision after poor decision. Let's set the stage just a little bit. The Conservative Party in Britain has been in charge for the last 14 years. It had an 80-seat majority from the election 5 years ago under Boris Johnson back in 2019. And that was considered a very large majority that would take a couple more election cycles for the Labour Party to even think about restoring. That was considered a landslide election at the time. And the Boris Johnson had put together groups of voters that the Conservative Party just hadn't been able to put together, including former Labour voters, anti-immigration voters, people in the left wing, people in the right wing, people in the center, by combining promises on immigration along with promises to spend more money to level up underserved communities and to end the austerity programs that the Conservative Party put in place at the beginning of the 14 years in government. And one thing to also understand is that the Conservative Party had built a brand in Britain over the several hundred years it's been in existence, largely based on a couple of things, tradition being a large part of it, but also fiscal responsibility and, let's just say, law and order. And over the last 5 years, the Tory party has systematically undercut its own brand. Boris Johnson, not a traditional-minded person, had several children out of wedlock. I think married shortly before, while he was prime minister. Not seen as if you were looking for central casting for what a prime minister looked like. I don't think Boris Johnson exactly who you would have in mind. And and also bear in mind, this was in the backdrop of the Brexit issue, where the UK was leaving the European Union. Boris Johnson was a major proponent of that and promised to, quote, get Brexit done. He definitely, sort of like Trump here in the States, had a proclivity for coming up with very catchy slogans with not a lot behind it in terms of policy or practicalities. And Boris Johnson got Brexit done, even though no one knew what Brexit meant at the time that they voted for it, or no one could really agree on it, but he got Britain out of it at just the exact time that COVID started up. And his response to COVID was dismal, particularly since at the point he finally put in place COVID restrictions on how people could relate to each other, how many people could be in a room together, and so forth, which resulted in Queen Elizabeth having to mourn the death of her husband on her own in a church. People in 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lived, were having parties. And there was photographic evidence. And so once that got out, and some other scandals were following up on him, he was forced to resign. And you can say he undermined the Tory brand in terms of law and order and law abiding. And already across Britain, the idea that for the Tories, there was one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. And so the polls showed an immediate drop in support for the Tories. The next prime minister lasted approximately 54 days. She came into office, and within 2 or 3 days, the Queen had died, and so a good portion of her time in office was spent in dealing with the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. And once that time was over, she put into place a budget that was considered incredibly fiscally responsible, that it tanked the British economy and led to enormous increases in interest rates and led to enormous mortgage rates, so that the housing market completely was destroyed, and people who had believed in that the Tories were the party that would lead to better home ownership, that belief was broken, probably for generations to come. And so in just 1 or 2 years, the brand that had been built up over, again, centuries for law-abiding, tradition, and fiscal responsibility was completely destroyed. Rishi Sunak then was named Prime Minister. He was the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is sort of the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury. And he had been sort of popular during COVID because he was the one who put together the financial aid packages during COVID to help people get through the financial hardships of the time. Rishi Sunak, as the name might suggest, is a person who is first-generation Briton. His parents are immigrants from India, and he incidentally married an incredibly wealthy woman who's also Indian, making him the richest person to ever serve as prime minister, and is considered wealthier than the king. And rather than eke out an existence as a break from the past, where he was trying to separate himself from the right-wing libertarian wing of the party that had led to Liz Truss's budget, he felt that he was too weak to do so. And so rather than politically say, I'm separate from Liz Truss, I'm separate from Boris Johnson, he felt he had to adopt some of their policies, including on immigration, including on some of the financial austerity measures. And so although he promised to change, it was very much more of the same. And so he couldn't really convincingly say that he was making a break from the past. And so the poll numbers never really changed. And so at some point this year, he had to call an election. And he had made various promises, including that one of the ideas that had come out of Boris Johnson was that because there was this problem with illegal immigrants coming to Britain, that seeking asylum, that they would ship those asylum seekers to another country and process the asylum claims there. That country, out of all the countries in the world, was the country of Rwanda. And if you're like me, most people associate that country with, let's say, not great things for people who are different. And yet this was the idea to essentially to be cruel to people seeking asylum in order to discourage them from coming to Britain. And Rishi Sunak adopted that plan and said that that the flights would leave for Rwanda, and that was his promise. He promised to get inflation down. He promised economic recovery. Of all the promises he made, the only one that really came into the fore was that inflation had been brought down to 2%. And the day that number was hit, he announced that he was dissolving Parliament and calling for an election. And that was just on May 22nd. None of his other promises were kept at all. And the idea, I think, was to essentially make a referendum on fulfilling the other promises he had made, trying to draw a contrast with the Labour Party, which is the main opposition party, and also to try to catch a brand new party called the Reform Party, which is a right-wing party, on the hop before it had really had a chance to get organized. Because most people assumed that the election would be held later in the year, in October, after the summer holidays. Now, again, the way British politics works is that the Prime Minister can call the election anytime they want, as long as it's within 5 years of the previous election, and he had till the end of the year to do that. And he chose July 4th, American Independence Day, to call the election for, and let's talk about that choice. The only people who knew were a very small circle of people. And there are two things about the day he chose. One, the most immediately stupid thing about that day was that it was raining. And he went and gave the announcement without an umbrella, which meant that he was drenched by the end of his announcement. And you can see videos and pictures, and he looks just like a drowned rat at the end of it. And that is not exactly a good image to launch any campaign on. Most in America, when you launch a campaign, you want, a town hall, a White House, a monument behind you, some significant thing. You don't want to appear completely like you've just stepped out of a car wash. The second thing about that is that people in his immediate circle, including police in his protection circle, including the head of including his other members of parliament, bet on the date of the election, which you can do in Britain, apparently. And that is illegal because it's insider betting. And so you had people, and this didn't come out till a couple weeks into the election, but what's particularly fascinating about that is that someone in the Labour Party was sort of keeping an eye on the betting markets and noticed that more bets had been placed. And he didn't go and bet on that date, but what he did do was go and buy time on TV and newspapers around July 4th, which meant that by the time Sunak told the people in his campaign, who weren't in his close circle of people, about the date, the Conservative Party couldn't buy those ads because Labour had already bought them. Like I said, worst campaign ever. So you had people in Sunak's orbit committing crimes and tipping off Labour as to when the date of the election was going to be. You had the image of Sunak looking like a drenched rat. Not off to a good start. One of the very first places Sunak goes to is he goes on a trip around the United Kingdom, and one of his first stops is in Northern Ireland, where he goes to Belfast, to the area where the shipyards are. Unfortunately, that is known as, wait for it, the Titanic Quarter. Yes, the place where the Titanic was built. why on earth would you go to a place called the Titanic Quarter, where it's synonymous with sinking? You just don't do that, and yet he did. They got pictures of him with an exit sign on his plane as he was flying around, because he has, of course, a private plane. One of the reasons why he was trying to do this early was to get reform on the back foot. And the strategy was for the first couple of weeks to move to the right to pick up reform voters, and say, we are going to deliver on a bunch of right-wing promises. The problem is a lot of people on the right didn't believe the Tory promises because they hadn't delivered on that Rwanda scheme. And part of it was to prevent this guy, Nigel Farage, from taking charge of the Reform Party, because although he had founded the party, he was much more interested at the time of helping Donald Trump out here in America. Well, at the last minute, he changed his mind and decided that, yes, he was going to run for a seat and take control of the Reform Party, which meant that automatically the Reform Party became a lot more popular because it now had this charismatic figurehead. And instead of picking up reform voters, those reform voters stuck. The right-wing voters stayed with reform. And so the Tories, by moving to the right, had now alienated a bunch of voters in the center, who now were free to move either to Labour or to this other party called the Lib Dems. And so the Tories now had to try to tack back to the center, where they'd already alienated a bunch of voters. So their strategy was now completely blown out of the water. In addition, by setting up this election on July 4th, if you look at the calendar, between May 22nd and July 4th, there is a very important date, which is D-Day, the D-Day anniversary. It was 60 years, 80, time flies. 70 years, 22 minus 40, 80 years since D-Day. And you had the entire Western world convening on Normandy to commemorate the passing of possibly the last time you'd have people who had actually been on the beaches of D-Day. You know, in 5 years, probably next year, there's going to be fewer and fewer. And so, of course, Prime Minister Sunak was there for the English celebrations. He left early. He left the D-Day commemorations early to go back to Britain to do an interview. And if you are trying to keep anti-immigration people on your side, who tend to skew older, let's say, who tend to skew patriotic, I think there's really only one thing you could do. There's nothing worse you could do than leave a commemoration for World War II early. There just isn't. And yet he did it. It was a terribly unforced error. It's just awful. He apologized for it the next day, but it just came across as lightweight, his apologies. How do you have those political instincts, or how do you have no political instincts to protect you from that? Regardless of anything else you can say about him, however smart he is, however, earnest he is, his instincts are just awful. And the instincts of any advisors he has are just awful. It turns out then at about the same time that the head of the Conservative Party changed his seat to try to pick up a safe seat so that he could stay in Parliament. That was not, as they say, a good look, and then refused to talk to any media about it. As I said, Nigel Farage and the Reform Party was picking up more and more seats. They tried to attack Labour for raising taxes by £2,000 by relying on what they called civil service calculations. Only it turned out that the civil service took the extraordinary step of writing a letter saying, we didn't actually make those calculations. Stop saying that we did. So it just felt like more lies going on. And bit by bit, it turned less and less likely that the Conservatives were going to win. And in fact, they had to, and this has been happening more day by day as the election has drawn on, they've had to change their resources to fighting defensively against what were called safe seats. Right now, as of the last polls from yesterday, the Tories were 20 points behind Labour. They're on about 20%. And because of how the British electoral system works, there are tons of seats that could come down to a few hundred votes one way or another. And so the Tories could have in a 650-seat parliament anywhere from 50 to 150 seats, maybe up to 200, maybe down to 5, just depending on how some people show up to vote. So we could see the Tories barely hanging on. We could see the Tories decimated as a party forever. And a lot of it could have been avoided with some just barely competent political decisions and strategies. And I think one of the reasons why I want to talk about it is just to also point out that, not all politics is about ideology. A lot of it is. Not all politics is about policy, although that is incredibly important. There's politics that is also about strategy. When you attack things, how you attack things, how you go about not just the business of politics, but the symbology of politics, the reaching out to people, letting them know that they're heard and listened to, that the same things that are important to them are important to us. Finding what is in common that we can all try to agree on and work together on. And I think that what the Conservative Party has done in terms of making poor decisions, definitely over the last 14 years, there are many reasons to sort of point out the terrible policy decisions they've made. And Jon Oliver, again, thank you for stealing my thunder 2 weeks before I had this idea. He did a piece on the election as well, but he didn't touch on a lot of these things. But the important thing is that, the decisions that were made since May have changed how this election is going to pan out. If Sunak had waited until later this year to run the election, it might have come out very differently. If he had stayed on for D-Day, if he had been better about communications handling, if he had been able to maneuver the party in such a way that he didn't immediately shift to the right, on different stances, if he had handled things involving messaging about, attacking Labor's tax policies, he would have had a better chance of getting his own message out. The current message right now is not so much about what Conservatives can do for the future, but a warning against Labor, which, as a strategy, again, talking about strategy, doesn't resonate because the people have had 14 years of Conservatives, and how is whatever you're probably saying about Labor going to be anything worse than what they've experienced in the last 14 years? At some point, you have to give them a story about how things can change. Yes, talking about how bad things can be, for example, under Trump and Project 2025, is going to be incredibly important. But we're also going to have to talk about what good we can do going forward. And I hope to talk about that in this podcast as well, because while we are talking about how fascism and Christian dominant supremacy might destroy us, we also have to talk about what we're building towards and what good could happen by going in this other direction. I don't think it has to be a utopian vision. I don't think it necessarily has to be a full and complete manifesto. But I think there has to be something that we can say that isn't just that way lies fascism. You have to give them hope too, as Harvey Milk once said. In any event, thank you very much. The election results will be coming in over the next couple of hours. I hope we'll have the results by the time I record my next video tomorrow, where I will hopefully begin to get into Project 2025. We'll be looking at, I believe, the introductory statement from that, as well as covering any possible news that has come out from either Britain or America. In the meantime, thank you very much. Keep calm, beat Trump, and keep left.